Hi there, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Josh.
And I'm Sarah.
And we are the Hiking Fools, guiding you through the trails of Glacier National Park. And we love heading out on the trails. We've had some great adventures recently. The season here at the time of recording of this episode is just getting into full swing. We're just into July. Snow is melting, things are opening up, and we are getting to some high points, some high places in the park, and loving it. And you'll have to check out as you plan your trips or as you look to hike in Glacier, check out some of our other episodes specifically on a lot of the trails. I mean, you've got plan your next hike in 20 minutes. Check it out. We've got 50 episodes out there leading up to this one, and you can really find a lot of the information you need to plan a trip or to have a great experience hiking in Glacier. But once in a while, we veer off the trail slightly and talk about something that will add to your experience, add to your knowledge and appreciation of the park. And that is sometimes history, sometimes science, sometimes special guests and authors, people that are experts in their field. And today we are going to do one of those episodes. We're digging into the Great Northern Railroad and what part it played in the establishment of Glacier, and how we got here to what we got to today, and how Glacier became such an attraction. And Sarah, there's a couple of specific people who helped pave this iron road to the crown of the continent.
Yeah, you probably have heard of his name, James J. Hill. So he, like you said, played a huge role in the establishment of Glacier Park, and tourism kind of headed out west from the east. He was Canadian born, and he was a businessman, and he really loved tourism, and he was born in 1838. But he came down to the United States eventually and lived in St. Paul, Minnesota, and that's where he found a business opportunity. So it was the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad, and they were really struggling financially. So he thought,
first and foremost, I think he was a businessman.
Yeah,
he recognized the opportunity, and he's by way of moving a Midwesterner. So I like him right away.
So in 1889, he actually formed the Great Northern Railroad. So he used his money, and he's like, I'm going to get this railroad up and moving. We're going to try to get freight over to the Pacific Ocean from the Great Lakes area. And that's exactly what he did.
Yeah.
And he did it rather quickly, too.
An effective young man, an industrious young man at the time, ready to, he capitalized on an opportunity, and you've got to give him credit for that.
Yeah, he started right away in 1890 building the railroad headed out here. And there was no other railroad in the northern section here, so he kind of took over in making that happen. So
started building the railroad. He was wearing a suit and issuing checks probably, and cashing, funding this project. But he was at the helm.
He had a vision, and it kind of goes back to, and we can touch on this later, but George Bird Grinnell, he played a role in James's vision for coming out west in the region, what is now Glacier National Park. So he recruited European immigrants to settle along the tracks as he built them. And during this time, everybody was wanting to go to Europe. Like tourism was going, I want to see the Swiss Alps. Let's go there. Let's go there. And he was like, wait a minute. Once the war started, he was like, let's stay here in the U.S.
What did he say? One of his famous phrases, see America first, right?
Yeah,
he came up with that.
See America first. So as he built the tracks headed west, he promoted, agriculture along with settling as he pushed further west. And because James was known as the empire builder, we now have a passenger train that's still called that today. So that's pretty cool. The Amtrak that runs now from Chicago to Seattle. But when the Great Northern Railroad was being established, it started in St. Paul, Minnesota, and moved to Seattle. The Chicago thing came later.
Yeah.
But unlike other transcontinental lines, it was constructed entirely without federal land grants. So it was different. He was kind of doing this himself and putting his money into it. And he really, really enjoyed it. And if you read any sort of writings by him, you can tell that this was this was his pride and joy,
Yeah,
building this railroad.
I heard he was, an inspiring individual, gave some terrific speeches and motivated so many others and involved and collaborated with so many other parties. There are other resources out there for certain, to go check out James J. Hill and the beginning of the Great Northern Railroad. And in fact, this is so pertinent because it's difficult to tell the story of Glacier National Park without also telling the story of the Great Northern Railway. And the two kind of grew together and shaped one another and became inseparable, really.
James's vision was the development of resources. So as I had mentioned, as he built these settlements and encouraged people settling along the tracks, he said, let's grow some, farmland and, agriculture and stuff. And he kind of promoted the railroad, like you grow wheat fields and then we can take your wheat or cattle or whatever and move it west, or this railroad line will be useful in selling off what you're producing on your farm.
Yeah, brilliant. That's a brilliant idea.
He knew that if the settlement surrounding would prosper, then his railroad would also prosper too.
At the end of the day, again, businessman, at the end of the day, he was behind the railroad and he had a lot of good ideas on how to make the railroad successful. I mean, you've got to involve others and, they prospered as well, as you mentioned, but he had this idea and he brought a lot of other people into his idea to make his idea successful. So this is very late in the 1800s, again, for a timeline, and the route that he envisioned would stretch, all the way from the Midwest's St. Paul to Seattle, connecting the Great Lakes with the Pacific Northwest. And he knew there were plenty of travelers that would make the trip and be excited about it. And later down the line and further in this episode, we'll talk a little bit more about how he promoted it and the great ideas he had, and kind of one of the pioneers in tourism, really. But Sarah, first, we've got the tracks need to be laid before the train can be run to this area. So they had a route, a vision, but how did it lay out?
Well, and if we rewind a little bit back in 1853, Governor Isaac I. Stevens came through this area with help of Hugh Monroe. And we've mentioned Hugh Monroe before. He came out here back in the early 1800s, and he was a fur trapper for the Hudson Bay Company. And he settled out what is now like the Two Medicine area with the Blackfeet and married a Blackfeet woman. So he told a lot of stories about the area and the Blackfeet, but Governor Isaac I. Stevens kind of came through and scouted this area a little bit with Hugh as his guide. And they came across what we know is Marias Pass and Highway 2 and the crossing of the Continental Divide in the Rocky Mountains. And it was established way back then, like this would be a huge feat. There was no roads or anything. And so when the railroad was becoming established, James J. Hill kind of knew, like, this is going to be a big feat. Like, how we need to lay tracks that are somewhat level. We can't have steam locomotives going up hills and mountains.
I, for one, am so glad that others found passes and ways over and through the Rocky Mountains, because you just imagine coming to a place and looking up and saying, I have no idea how we're going to get up and over this, much less build a track for the railroad. But yeah, they had scouts and engineers, I'm sure, and a lot of smart people figuring that out. And these are a few of them. Hugh Monroe, a great character in the story of Glacier National Park, also known as Rising Wolf, and married, as Sarah mentioned, a Blackfeet woman, Sinapa. And so there's some of the great peaks surrounding Two Medicine Lake that you can check out.
I love how history is just kind of connected. Everybody is connected in a way, almost like, I don't know, a story, a movie, It's really, really cool.
Yeah, it is. And as I mentioned very early on, right at the beginning of the show, it really, I think, increases your appreciation of Glacier National Park when you see and feel the history behind it. Everything that came before you, it just adds layers to your experience here. And Sarah, we're going to talk a little bit more about how the train got up and over and through Glacier National Park, but we're going to take a short break. Stick with us. We really appreciate Freedom Bank as a sponsor of this show.
You wouldn't haul a 50-pound pack for a 3-mile hike, so why bank with a place that loads you down? At Freedom Bank, we keep it simple, smart, and mobile. so you can bank from your tent, the lake, or the top of Mount Brown. Proud sponsor of Hiking Fools because life's an adventure, and we've got your back. Freedom Bank. We want to be your bank. Give us a call at 892-1776. Member FDIC.
For everything summer in Montana, think Snappy's. Snappy Sports Center is not only your fishing and hunting headquarters, they're also stocked with hiking boots, backpacks, camping gear, bear spray, and outdoor clothing for the whole family. Located on the corner of Highways 2 and 35 on your way to Glacier Park and away from the traffic on Highway 93. Forgot something? They probably have it. Need something? They definitely have it. Skip the traffic and stock up on adventure with Snappy Sports Center, a store like no other since 1947.
Welcome back. We are the Hiking Fools, and if you could only hear what we discuss during the break, you would maybe enjoy that, some B-roll as well. But we definitely appreciate our sponsor, Snappy Sports Center. Awesome place in Kalispell to be outfitted. But we have been discussing the Great Northern Railroad, as you know. I appreciate you sticking with us through the story of it. And Sarah, you know, we're right on the precipice of Glacier National Park here with the construction of the railroad now.
Yeah, and if you've been out here and you've driven Highway 2, which is the southern boundary of Glacier National Park, it runs parallel with the Middle Fork River, and that's where the railroad runs.
Yeah,
the railroad tracks have built right through here across the Continental Divide, and as we mentioned before, that was kind of a big feat, and they needed some professionals to kind of figure that out, some special engineers. So the Great Northern Railroad hired the chief surveyor in 1889, John F. Stevens, and he came out and kind of figured out a route through what is Marias Pass. And he kind of, I think the river helped with that too, because naturally it's going to be a lower level where the river runs through.
Follow the river, when you're creating a railroad. And it's neat, the road, as the river does, kind of create the southern boundary of the park. So if you're driving between East and West Glacier, you're in and out of the park in a little bit, and you're crossing the railroad too. I mean, the railroad goes under some things and under some bridges and over some others, and you kind of see it on your right and then on your left. Yeah. And Marias Pass, you mentioned it before, I forget. It's a great stopping place. It's a great stop if you're traveling this route by car.
Yeah.
It's, there's some recognition there of both the indigenous peoples and some of these explorers, I'll call them.
Well, yeah, there's a statue of John F. Stevens actually there, kind of. It's mimicking what he must have looked like as he stood here surveying this area. There's also a monolith there, But yeah, the Rocky Mountains, they were seemingly impenetrable. It's just this giant mass. How do we get across this? And it's almost unexplored, and it's surrounded by indigenous tribes that we weren't super familiar with at the time. We had people like Hugh Monroe, as I mentioned, came out earlier, and then George Bird Grinnell, he made friends with the Blackfeet and came back and wrote about them in Forest and Stream. But there wasn't a whole lot. And
You're right. And also take a moment here to express that long before, George Bird Grinnell and James J. Hill and these people, Stevens, discovered these places. These mountains have been home to the indigenous peoples for thousands of years,
Absolutely.
right? The Blackfeet, Salish, Kootenai, Pend Oreille, and others, knew every valley, pass, and river. So while we think we were discovering this, it was really, the mountains along that eastern front held profound spiritual significance and sacred places to them. So we must remember that as we talk about the discovery of Glacier and the, and the new parts of America that people were seeing. It's we need to recognize that.
I agree. Thank you for bringing that in. Absolutely. And that was part of it too with, moving west with the tracks is getting to know the Blackfeet, their history, their culture, the geology, the climate, the flora and fauna, the topography of this whole region, winter snow depths, like those all played a role in the engineering and the construction of the tracks coming west and making its way to the Pacific Ocean. So that was a little bit of planning, but they didn't waste a whole lot of time. They made a friendship with the Blackfeet also as they came through, but he did it. John F. Stevens, he figured out a way through the Rocky Mountains, and that was a really big deal.
Yeah.
But once the tracks came through that area, then in 1891, the Great Northern Railroad, the train itself reached the small settlement of Midvale, and that was what East Glacier was called way back when. And now it's called East Glacier. And he actually built the Great Northern Railroad, James J. Hill. He built a proper station in 1912. And then the lodge itself, which is located outside of Glacier National Park, was built in 1913. And he actually hired some of the Blackfeet families to dress up in their beautiful full regalia and stand on the platform as the train came into the depot to greet guests. And that was kind of advertised back east as well, like come out and, meet the indigenous people and see them in all their glory.
Yeah. I'm sure it was an interesting relationship there. I mean, without, exploiting, these folks. And it's, I think it's a sensitive issue still, obviously, how to promote the park and give that experience, that feeling of it being the Old West, but also, encroaching on some territory and understanding that mutual respect needed to take place here.
Josh, how much time do we have left?
We've got, a few minutes in this episode.
Okay, you just let me talk. No talking.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so the Belton area, the small railroad of the Belton area, which is now West Glacier, that was a railroad work camp, and the train reached that area in 1891, 1892-ish, and that station there was built in 1910. And as we know, Glacier National Park became established in 1910, so this railroad area coming through here was before it became a national park.
Yeah, in 1893 is when the Great Northern Railway reached Seattle, and us completing the last major transcontinental railroad in the U.S.
Yes, and actually a businessman named Ed Dow built the Belton Hotel for travelers that wanted to see Lake McDonald, and that was back in 1894.
In West Glacier area. We're all the way to West Glacier
Yeah,
now.
We're in the Belton area. So James, he made an awesome heading coming from east, headed west with the railroad, but it was time for him to retire. So in 1907, James J. Hill left as president of the Great Northern Railroad, and he became chairman of the board. So naturally, his son stepped forward in 1907, Lewis W. Hill, and he was super passionate about this area as well. And so James actually retired in 1912, but his son was a part of this for a while. But I just want to read a quote that James said, because I think it's really cool. He said, "Most men who have really lived have had, in some shape, their great adventure. This railway was mine." So naturally, his son took over and echoed that vision and his passion. And his dad, James, saw that until he passed away in 1916. So the tourism was promoted to Glacier, by his son, Lewis W. Hill. And the railway now, it runs 8,316 miles, and it carries freight, passengers, and mail. So, we can applaud this development coming west. Like, this is a big deal. We all kind of make use of that. And I get kind of excited when we're driving the highway and we see the Empire Builder. It comes through west to east certain times of the day, twice a day only. And we've ridden it a few times, just coming around from, Whitefish, Montana to Essex or whatever. And it's really cool to know the history of this. So Lewis launched the See America First along with his dad. He wanted to attract all that American tourism. Come on, let's stay in America. Don't go to Europe. We have mountains that resemble the Swiss Alps, and that kind of prompted all the lodges and the chalets to resemble that Swiss-style construction.
So, Sarah, this has been and will continue to be a fascinating story about the development of this area. We've learned so much about the history and the point leading up to the establishment of Glacier National Park, and that's where we're going to head in part 2 of this discussion, of this episode. And, I think we're going to talk more about tourism, a little bit of conservation and the people that played an important role in that promotion, and then kind of what brings us up until today. And I think the development of the park is worth considering as we learn to appreciate it and explore it and discover it ourselves. But we will see you. We will see you there in part 2. But check out our Instagram page at HikingFoolsMT to see some great photos from our recent adventures. Sarah and I and some friends just climbed up a nice little peak in the Many Glacier area. Check that out. Check out more episodes online. We've got a ton out there, as we mentioned. And remember to follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts to be alerted of the latest episode. I'm Josh.
And I'm Sarah.
And we are the Hiking Fools, encouraging you to always go